Um, okay, hi everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. I know it's not always easy mornings, especially if you've got young kids and you've got to do drop-off at schools, or if you've just got to do a blow-dry like me. It's just not easy, is it, always getting here on time. This is our first diversity inclusion event for the BSME this year. It's something that me and the committee are really proud of because, well, firstly, I'm Deborah Joseph. I'm the chair of the BSME. And when I started speaking to people about what they wanted from the BSME, there was an overwhelming feeling that they wanted us to reflect the changes in our industry and the people and diversity in our industry. And so that's something that especially Andrea Thompson and I, my vice chair, were really keen to work on. So this is our first event, obviously about the issues that women have faced in the media. And although women aren't a minority, my God, we have faced some issues, right? From discrimination through gender pay gap, maternity leave pay, to being overlooked for promotions, being just told to be more quiet than we need to be. And Andrea and I have quietly been discussing these things over a glass of wine for over 20 years about how is it going to be for women in the future in the industry, and also ageism, right? And so to be able to have this conversation out in the open like this in the morning it's a real blessing. I'm proud to say we've got two more diversity and inclusion events coming up. One in September, which is the Barriers to Entry for Black Journalists, also hosted by Andrea. And in October, How to Discuss the Trans Issues, and that'll be hosted by Cliff Joannou. I also wanted to thank the Rosewood London and especially Amelia for putting this on today. Another thing I really wanted to do was bring back the glamour to the BSME, and I think we've managed that this morning. So thank you so much. It was so nice to see everyone's response when you walked in. Please do tag them if you're going to post images because we want to show our support. I know they care deeply about diversity and inclusion issues as well. So to have such a great partner, not just for this event, but also they're going to be hosting our big dinner awards later on in the year, which I hope to see you all at. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Also, quickly coming up later on in the year, we're doing an event for TikTok. I want to help everybody to digitize and feel comfortable posting on social media as part of your jobs in the media. Now we know that's an everyday part, right? And so many of you have said, I'm too embarrassed to admit that I don't know how to create a TikTok and I don't know how to create a reel. So we're going to do an event, and by the end of the event, we hope you will have all posted your first TikTok, if that's what you want. We've also got an interview event. Anna Winter, my boss, is coming to do a talk, so I hope to see you all at that. That promises to be interesting. She is going to talk about the importance of digitisation, and as the most high-profile person in magazines, I think that's going to be an interesting conversation. But now over to Andrea and our incredible panel. I hope you enjoy it, and I'd love your feedback. Thank you so much.
Christine. Thank you very much. Thanks, Deborah. So I'm Andrea Thompson, Editor-in-Chief at Marie Claire, and as Deborah said, Vice Chair at the BSME. And I'm really delighted to be here today to host the first of 3 events. As Deb said, you know, we've been talking about doing this for a very long time. Mainly because, you know, although there's been so much progress in the industry, there really is so much more work to be done to make sure that our teams and our companies are representative of the country that we live in. And this is really important because sometimes we forget our influence as journalists on millions and millions of people every day through the content that we're creating. And we really need to be reflective of the views of the country. And so having discussions like this and implementing change in our companies is really important. Today's discussion is going to be focused around women and the challenges they face. But we're also going to look at how age, class and race intersect to make that challenge harder for many women. In terms of barrier to entry, but also, you know, retaining jobs in the industry. And we're going to talk about some of the solutions that need we need the solutions we need to make sure that women's voices continue to be heard in the industry. So I'm going to now introduce all of our guests. First of all, we have Bosola Evans. Bosola is a freelance interiors journalist. Most recently, she was executive editor of The World of Interiors and editor of its highly regarded online directory, The Interiors Index. Bosola is deputy chairperson of the Women in Journalism, the UK's leading organisation for female journalists. A journalist for over 20 years, she's written for The Guardian, The Times Magazine, The Sunday Telegraph, Grazia, and ES Magazine, and she was deputy editor and columnist at Living Etc. and associate editor at Living Etc. and Homes and Gardens Magazine. Terry White is a multi-award-winning editor, journalist, broadcaster, author, and screenwriter. She is currently developing her book, Coming Undone, a memoir for television. Terry writes for a range of publications, including The Sunday Times, The New Statesman, British Vogue, Guardian, Elle, and The Big Issue. And she worked in publishing for 2 decades, editing magazines such as Empire, Time Out New York, and has just made her first documentary and podcast series for the BBC. Eleanor Mills is the founder and editor-in-chief of Noon, a new platform for women in midlife who she terms queenagers, which I absolutely love. Eleanor is an award-winning editor, former chair of Women in Journalism UK, and editorial director of the Sunday Times and the Times. Well, was, yes. Was. She is also a prize-winning feature writer, columnist, and interviewer. And Eleanor is a trustee of the Reporters Sans Frontières and author of Cupcakes and Kalashnikovs, 100 Years of Best Journalism by Women. Wow. I mean, they're all so brilliant. That was a mouthful getting it all out. Thank you very much.
The Sunday Times Magazine.
Yes.
7 years, which is quite relevant in this
Absolutely.
context.
I'd like to start with you, Terry, actually, because you built a very successful career as a writer and editor, rapidly rising through the ranks to senior management. And you were at the helm of some really recognisable brands in this country, but you often said that you didn't come across people that came from your sort of background. What were the main challenges you faced?
I might need that. Thanks. So for me, the big issue has always been class, which I wrote about recently for the New Statesman when there was some new NUJ data which basically showed how awful the class situation is in journalism. So I don't think it'll surprise anybody in this room that there's a massive overrepresentation of the privately school educated, and not just middle classes but upper middle classes. And it was exactly what you were saying, right? You end up with a monolithic media that speaks one kind of view to one kind of person and doesn't fully represent the views of the country. So that's kind of the outside view, but as somebody working within the industry, I was often the only working class person in the room, always kind of a lone voice. I tried to hide my class for years. I mean, probably not very well, look at me. I mean, you know, they used to, when I had my first job in magazines, they called me pram face because they said I looked like I should be pushing a pram on a council estate. So that gives you the kind of idea about, like, the way that class, I suppose, it's always been very visible for me. I've always felt like it enters a room when I enter a room, whether it was a meeting or a presentation to advertisers, whatever it was, I felt like I was stuck with, I felt like it was on my skin, that my class was on my skin. And I think it's much more difficult. And I think it's got, without wanting to be a massive Debbie Downer in this gorgeous room, like it's got worse and harder because as magazines have shrunk particularly, and investment in brands and staff has shrunk, those entry-level jobs that were key. I started off as a secretary. Those jobs, those PA, editorial assistant jobs, don't really exist anymore. And so how are people getting in? You know, internships, basically. Who can afford to do internships? People who are independently wealthy or supported by their parents. So how are working class kids going to get into magazines? I don't know the answer to that question. I think as an industry, we really need to reckon with that and say, what routes are we giving our most talented but our most disadvantaged kids to enter this industry that we all love so much?
Thank you. And what do you think has been the impact on the content being produced around you? I mean, you touched on this in an article for the New Statesman recently with the strikes, but, you know, what in your career, what has been the impact on that, of that?
Well, I mean, you just sit in a room and you have a singular view, which you either kind of put forward and risk that challenge of getting it heard and over the line, or you keep it to yourself, which I was going to say I did for a long time, but I'm not sure I ever did, actually. I've always had a bit of a gob on me. But it's difficult because we do see it throughout media. So the Mick Lynch interviews were remarkable to me because the lines of questioning were all very much similar. We're all very much concerned about how it was being viewed from a middle class perspective. There was nobody there actually talking about workers' rights and how being paid a fair wage and having good working conditions is a basic human right, and that is something we should all be fighting for as human beings. So I think it's basically influences every newsroom. I've been in the BBC for the last 8 months making this documentary. You see it wherever you go, and it makes it incredibly challenging sometimes. And I think what you have to be really careful of if you're a working class journalist is not becoming what I call a working class sideshow. So everything is viewed through the prism of being working class. Everything is viewed through your experiences of being working class. If you grew up in poverty or you've suffered abuse or any of these things, there has to be a level of protection I think you put around yourself so that when you're in the working environment, you're not just viewed for your class, but you're also able to advocate for it as well. It's a difficult balance.
Thanks, Terry. Basola, you often speak about the importance of diversity on teams and in content in your role at Women in Journalism. What kind of feedback do you get from members about, the state of play at the moment and the challenges that women are facing as we, in the midst of a, crisis in terms of, budgets being cut and so many pressures financially?
Yeah, I think that, the feedback we're getting, first of all, we're sort of getting the feedback that things are getting better in terms of women entering certain spaces. But the problem is that women are not getting to that sort of the hierarchy. You're still, so women are struggling to sort of make their place there. Certainly, and even more so when you sort of talk about sort of diverse women, sort of people, of colour, that sort of thing, disabilities, all that sort of stuff. We don't see them still at the sort of higher levels. So that's, that is still a problem. And it's really been heightened, I think, during this period with all the economic challenges, because what we find is that women seem to be sort of the first lot of people to be let go. Often women are more likely to be in part-time employment, for instance, and there's still an attitude, particularly on newspapers where there are, sort of more men in charge. There's this attitude that if you're working part-time, you're just doing it for a hobby. It's not important, or you don't really need the money. You're just sort of doing it to sort of keep busy, and that somehow makes you more dispensable. So when they're sort of trying to, decide to get rid of people, they're like, oh, well, she only does 2 days a week or 3 days a week, so, she just clearly doesn't really need to work. So there's a problem there. So sort of women are more likely to be let go. Also, we have the issue where, because of the gender pay gap, women are more likely to fall into financial difficulty when they lose a job. So I think research shows that it would take, after losing the job, men would take about 4 to 6 weeks where they, it has an impact. With women, it's about 2 weeks. And that's because we are less financially robust. So there's all these things that are sort of, in some ways things are getting better, and certainly in the climate we're in now, things are very, very difficult and problematic for women.
And what can companies do then? What can they do in terms of recruiting and retaining women? Like, what key changes would you like to see?
Wow, well, that's a big question. That's a huge question. I think really it's about having just generally inclusive hiring processes, really. I'm very anti in any establishment having just one person hiring. That is so problematic, and I've seen it all through my career. When you've got one person hiring, they're looking for essentially an image of themselves, or they have their prejudices, their conscious and unconscious biases. I think there should always be at least 3 people in that hiring process or in the shortlisting process. I think there needs to be more flexibility. I mean, this is something that we've talked about for ages, but in terms of flexibility of hours, I mean, there was lots of talk about that over the pandemic, and everyone was like, "Oh no, we've really changed how we're going to work now. It's going to make it so much easier." And I've seen situations where employers become still so hard-ass about people working at home or working part-time or job sharing. There's just this. I don't know what it is, this fear of middle management disappearing or something, but there's still that sort of, sort of people are so anti it still. That's a major area that still needs to be worked on, and just allows people, because what happens is that you lose so many people, because it becomes so inflexible that they have to sort of step out of journalism and find something else that will give them the flexibility they need. And this is not just about childcare. It's life. It's your general life journey. It's not just women with children that need that flexibility. I think we all do. We all know we do.
Eleanor, I was going to talk to you a bit about your experiences setting up Noon, but before I do, I'd really love to pick up on that point that Bosola was just talking about, because you have spoken a lot about the need for flexible work to support women at all stages of their life, particularly in later stages as well. And as a manager at the Sunday Times, this is something that you must have seen, time and again. How did you support women, and what were the failings that companies...
I tell you what is really depressing is my daughter is now 20, my eldest daughter, and I had her when I was the editor of the news review at the Sunday Times. And talking about the kind of hours and lack of flexibility. So that's back in 2002. And I actually went in and resigned after I came back from maternity leave because they were so horrible to me. I tell you, one of the great things now about not working for any media brands, working for myself, is I can speak with total honesty about what happened. So I came back, they were really mean to me. It was like, and I was so unhappy that I remember going into my editor and resigning, saying, I just don't want to do this anymore. And him going, well, why, where are you going? I was like, I don't know where I'm going. I don't care where I'm going. I'm not doing this anymore. And they were really shocked. And he said, give me a bit of time to sort something out. And a week later, they offered me a day at home. So this is in 2002, which was unheard of. So I was allowed to work at home on a Wednesday and only do a half day on a Monday. And basically on a Friday, I did 9 a.m. till 2 a.m. the following morning every week, because the news review went to press at 2 a.m. on a Saturday morning. So, it wasn't that massive a concession. But it did make the difference between me leaving and staying. And I also had another child while I was there. But I find it unbelievable that 2 decades ago, I had that fight, and we're still talking about that now, after the pandemic, when everybody worked from home. And I think the thing about flexibility, what was interesting in the time that I was there was that I then used to have quite a lot of young men coming to me and saying, well, you're obviously, you're a senior woman who's also a mother, you've made it work. How did you do that? How did you have this conversation with the kind of senior management about being able to pick up your kids from school? Or I had a lot of younger men coming saying, I really want to pick up my daughter from nursery, say, and having to have that conversation with a much more dinosaur kind of line manager was really difficult, because they just didn't understand why these younger men wanted, but more as has been seen, the kind of women's thing of actually getting home to see their children's put them to bed. So I think that there's some really interesting kind of intergenerational stuff going on around those conversations. It's a shame that really the culture hasn't shifted. So the men who want to work in that way are still coming up against the same kind of barriers that we did as senior women. And I've just done a big piece of research so I left the Sunday Times 3 years ago, and I set up my own media company, which is called noon.org.uk, which is noon because in the 100-year life, 50 is only halfway through. So I talk about Queen Ages, and I'm trying to change the narrative about the script that we have about the later stages of women's lives, because we're all living a lot longer. Women, 50 to 75 are not old now. If we're all going to kind of live for a long time, we're all going to have to go on working till we're at least 70. And there's a massive disconnect I could see between the reality of the lives of women 45 to 65, 70 and the way that they are portrayed in the media. As chair of Women in Journalism for nearly 10 years, I used to talk a lot about the male lens of the media. exemplified for me by, I remember Nicola Sturgeon going to see Theresa May to talk about Brexit. And the front page of the Daily Mail the next day was, forget about Brexit, it's all about Legxit. Who's got the best legs? And I always remember that as a particularly egregious example, because it was saying it doesn't matter if you are the most powerful woman in the country, all you're going to be judged on is your appearance, how good your legs are. And so that for me is the absolute epitome of the male lens. And at Women in Journalism, we've been really talking about that and saying that it's really important that, exactly as you're saying about representation, that it's really important that the media is a reflecting mirror, not a distorting lens. And it becomes a distorting lens if everybody on the back bench is a man of like 65 who went to Oxbridge and is really posh and basically quite misogynist. So I think that that's what we really have to guard against. And Bisola was talking about diversity. I was really shocked. The last piece of research I commissioned before I left Women in Journalism was about race in the British press. And I actually resigned from the Society of Editors over all the Meghan Markle stuff. The chap came out saying that there was no racism in the British press. And I resigned from the Society of the chair of the Society of Editors. And I resigned from the board saying there is structural racism in the British press because there is no representation. And we had the data to back that up. So we did a big survey at Women in Journalism, and in the 2 weeks after George Floyd's death, there was not a single article on the front page of a British newspaper written by a black journalist. And the number of people of colour in editing positions within the newspapers was vanishingly tiny. It was kind of less than 1%. So I argued that you couldn't say that there was no structural racism in the British press if there was no representation, basically, of people of colour. And it was clear in the kind of reporting that you saw around Meghan Markle that there was a deep double standard going on between how she was portrayed compared to Kate Middleton. So I think that we have real problems as an industry around representation, and I think it matters massively because the broader population look to magazines, to newspapers for a true reflection of their lives, and what they get is something very distorting, and then that really affects how people see themselves. So my prism on this now is around gendered ageism, where ageism meets sexism. We can talk about that a bit more. But that again is women are seen through a male lens, which values them for their fecundity and their fanciability or their hotness, not for all the other aspects of their characters. So at Noon, I'm trying to, we run a whole load of inspirational content, which is all about what women are capable of, kind of from 50 onwards. And we've also done a huge piece of research with Accenture, which is the most in-depth study of women 45 to 65 and what they're really doing, what their attitudes are. And what's really interesting around that, I think for all of you in this room, is that 63% of university-educated women, 45 to 65, who are called by Forbes magazine super consumers, behind over 90% of all consumer household spending, say that they would be way more likely to buy from a brand that represents them. And yet, as an older woman, the only thing that anyone ever tries to sell me are tenor incontinence pants and life insurance. Or, if I'm lucky, those kind of silver-haired couples kind of walking down the beach. And again, like 40% of the women are on their own, so that doesn't work. So there's a huge lack of representation, not just within the media, also within advertising and within broader brands.
Thank you. And this is a question for all of you, really. How can we make sure that women who are working flexibly and, needing to adjust their working patterns because of, age or childcare, remain visible and, have access to career progression? Because one of the things when we've talked about age and class, we should probably actually touch on having kids as well, and how that impacts people's careers.
Well, I'll take this because I quit my job after I had my baby. So I was editor of Empire for 6 years, my dream job, the best job in the world. My art director is over there, he's amazing. I miss him every single day. And I miss my job every single day. And I had a baby and had a conversation not dissimilar to yours, but my conversation went, I'm working 19-hour days. Is there any way I can not work 19-hour days and work? I'll still work 5 days. I'll still work loads of hours, but can I not work 19-hour days? Let's come up with a solution. And no solution was forthcoming, so I quit my job, a job that I loved very much, but I wasn't willing to sacrifice my child over it. I had one of those moments like, you know, like the dad in the movies who misses his son's baseball game because he's like gone to a big meeting. I was that person, so I'd get home and he'd be asleep and I'd look at him at 3 a.m, and it was just, I was like, this is untenable. And what really pisses me off, quite honestly, is that our industry, there is a lot of talk about flexible working, there is a lot of talk about making things better for women and for people generally. I think it's a really valid point about men and about because we're talking about caring responsibilities, we're talking about people with stuff other than children, people who want to have a balanced life and have other stuff going on. But what, in my experience, publishing companies aren't yet willing to do is to resource that and invest in it. So they go, they say all the right things, and they do, like, put on special sessions in their buildings, and, you know, they put out press releases, but what they absolutely will not do, in my experience, is put money behind it. So resource your teams properly. Like, no big magazine like Empire, for example, should be existing on 11 staff working across social, print, digital, podcasts, live events, like, because actually it wasn't just untenable for me, it was untenable for my team. And I think as women, we have a responsibility to model what kind of good working practice looks like. So I feel guilty personally that for the best part of 20 years, I was single for most of it, I lived alone, I loved my work, and I worked ridiculous hours. And I was willing to do that, and I was willing to work weekends, I was willing to do whatever it took. And so after I had the baby, it wasn't the job that changed, it was me that changed. But I'd also been modelling bad behaviour for my entire team because I'd been saying to them that it's okay to work these hours. And it's not for whether you've got kids or not got kids, it doesn't matter. You should be able to have a quality and a balance of life. So invest in your teams, make sure they're staffed properly. If a woman comes to you and wants some kind of, you know, flexible working, commit to making that happen. What does she need to be able to keep doing her job? And come up with solutions instead of, at the moment, there is a real willingness to lose women from our industry. They are happy to see us fall out of magazines, even when we're really fucking good at our jobs, because they're not willing to actually commit to proper solutions. And they think that we're replaceable and there'll be another generation of younger women come up after us who can replace us until those women also face challenges and then they drop out of the industry. So I think there has to be a proper commitment to change that will take money, that will take proper care, and I think there has to be, and it comes right back to female representation, which is if your board and your MDs and your CEOs are all men who aren't invested in that as an issue, then it's really, really hard to make that a priority for your business.
Thank you. Is that...
Yeah. No, I was going to completely agree with what Terry says. I think that one of the key things is that sort of magazines do not normalise bad practice. And often what is normalised is that, yes, you know, I worked somewhere before where it was deemed completely normal to work all the hours, leave at sort of 6-ish, go home, fire up again, work until about 12-1, then, you know, stuff, you know, get some sleep, go, and that was considered normal. And it was something that was not really spoken about, but was really, was expected. You know, it was quite expected to work at the weekends, it was quite expected to work in the evenings. And I just think that, you know, as women progress and sort of get to sort of the, you know, the higher, higher managerial positions, I think there needs to be responsibility there, that these things are just not normalised. I mean, I'm sad to actually sort of say as well that when I had my daughter, and she's 12 in a couple of weeks, so 12 years ago, I wasn't actually brave enough to go and demand sort of better working hours, only because I'd seen a number of people before me do that and got nowhere. So what happened with me is I just didn't go back. And again, it was it was a good job that I enjoyed and I was paid well for. And what happens when that you end up just starting from scratch. Essentially, you lose, and this is all part of the sort of gender pay disparity when you're having to give up a good paying job because, you know, there's that inflexibility, and you are starting as a freelancer trying to get, you know, at a time where freelance articles are probably at the same rate as they were 20 years ago. Lower.
And 20 years ago, we used to often pay £1,000 for like a small feature in the Sunday Times. I mean, now it'd be like 300 or 400.
Yeah, and I remember when I started out as a youngster, I would get paid £100 a shift, you know. And I thought I was loaded, you know. Honestly, I thought, you know, and now people still pay £100 a shift, you know. And you know, I was being paid that in the late 90s. So it's insane. So when you go from a decent paying job and then you start freelancing, you know, instantly there's that massive pay gap. And if we're talking about women all over the country, you know, hundreds, thousands of women doing this, you can easily see why there's such a problem in terms of pay.
Yeah, I mean, and if you then put in the intersectionality there of age, I mean, we were chatting before we came on stage about what happened to all the older women in the industry. I mean, I think it's really interesting. So I was made redundant from the Sunday Times when I was 49. And when I went, all the other senior women at the paper also were made redundant, if not immediately in the ensuing months. And then you lose a whole generation of role models who are also carrying the kind of cultural kind of hinterland of that institution go.
Knowledge,
but also Sheryl Sandberg's latest piece of research, Lean and McKinsey, looks at what those senior women within organisations do, and they're also the custodians of the cultural capital. It's the senior women who are much more likely to mentor younger talent, and particularly more diverse talent. 68% more likely to do that than an equivalent senior man. So also when you whack those senior women, you take away a lot of the kind of, you know, nurturing environment, you know, if you're lucky within companies. I'm not saying all senior women are lovely and nurturing. We know that's not the case. Let's be real here. But if you look at that age bit, I think is really important because it's also a massive issue for the industry because of the huge buying power, which is now located in the Queen Ages. So if you have a whole industry which is not thinking about those women who are buying stuff, not just... So if you meet a woman of 50, she might have a kid who's 3, or like me, one who's 20. You know, you don't know. So they're buying for younger kids, they're buying for their parents, they're buying for themselves, they're buying for their own households. That's why they're they have such huge spending power, and brands are ignoring them. And as a society, we're so obsessed with youth, we're completely missing what's right in front of us. So by 2025, over half of the US workforce will be over 50. In the UK, it's by 2030. We're sitting on a kind of a massively aging population. And I think as a publishing industry, we're really not catching up with that. That's why I set up my company, which actually looks specifically at this cohort. If you just think about the names of the magazines, which are directed at women like me, Good Housekeeping, Woman and Home. I mean, crikey, I've never been a housekeeper. I've always had my husband's always done all the kind of, you know, the stuff at home. And that's half of women of 50 are the main breadwinners in their households. So I think that we're really behind the curve and missing a trick. And also, it's not surprising if all the senior women in the industry, you know, get whacked. So they either fall out after they have kids, as Basola and Terry have described. I interviewed the new global chair of the 30% Club a few weeks ago for The Telegraph, Hanneke Schmitz. And she said to me that what we're now seeing is a second brain drain of women kind of 45 to 55 who are dropping out of corporates and jobs at absolutely record levels. Again, the McKinsey research shows that for every woman who's made a director, 2 women leave. So it's not surprising that we've got a massive gender pay gap, and we've still only got, say, out of 100 FTSE CEOs, only 8 are women. I mean, FTSE's not everything, but it's a good indication of what's happening in senior leadership. So I hoped when I first started writing about all this stuff, 25 years ago, that by now it would be massively different. Hanneke Schmitz said to me, at current progress, it'll take hundreds of years for women to get to parity in senior leadership. So what we're seeing is a massive fallout for the old stuff around motherhood, and then followed by a gendered ageism hit of women between 45 and 55 who leave the workforce. And they are now leaving, they're setting up their own companies in higher numbers than any other demographic, which I think is interesting. And they leave because they just get sick of the corporate culture. So either they get pushed out, or they go, I just can't be dealing with having all my decisions second guessed by, somebody who hasn't been doing it as long, who isn't as senior, or is suggesting something that you've already did 10 years ago. I hear that. I've interviewed a whole load of women who are leaving the BBC, producers who've been there for 20, 30 years, just saying, I just can't deal with the bullshit any longer. So there's that as well. But I think that's a real problem if you look at the demographics of our society and where the financial clout lies, and not to mention just general injustice.
Thank you, Eleanor. We're short of time, so I'm going to finish by asking whether you would all actually recommend a career, whether you'd still recommend it to young women today, and what advice you would pass on to anyone embarking on a career in the media.
You know what, I feel really bad having said everything we've said here. I mean, I would totally still recommend it. I mean, I'm sorry. On paper, I shouldn't be recommending this industry at all. But at its best, it's the most brilliant industry to be in. I mean, I personally wanted to be a journalist from the time I was about 12. And it has met every expectation. I think that I think the advice I'd give is that you need to write what you care about, and actually what you care about can shift throughout your career. In my 20s, sort of my late 20s, I was a celebrity journalist. That was what I cared about. I really enjoyed going out and, sort of dancing on the table with Mel B and sort of, doing mad stuff like that and doing a dance off with a cheeky girl. But then, now I'm in interiors, and that's the great thing about journalism, is that you can write about anything. And now that we have so many different platforms, there are these opportunities. I mean, pay and all that issue is a separate thing. Sort of, I think that the pay for digital is wanting, but you have all these platforms now that you can write for. They're all lots of brands now, whereas before they had sort of very sort of boring editorial copywriting opportunities. Now they all want to editorialize their content and sort of make it very more much more magazine-like. So there's so many opportunities there. So I would say write about what you care about. Read a lot. I think that the more you read, and from not just in the industry or the area you specialise in, but sort of get a nice breadth of stuff that you read about, and just go and believe in yourself, because I think that one of the issues with women is that we just don't believe in ourselves enough. And I say to myself, and it's a mantra, I need to channel a mediocre white man. This is what I need to do to get on in life. Because we always question ourselves. We always, I've been in situations where someone's been in a job for 2 weeks and went for another job within, just had that confidence, and that, and I thought, oh my God, there's a woman. And I had this conversation with other women actually. We just like, oh my God, we just wouldn't. If you started a job 2 weeks ago, you just wouldn't even dare go for another job. And I was just like, my God, this is what men do. They just go for it. And we need to do that and go for things and have confidence in ourselves and stop questioning ourselves. We do that every woman I know is no matter how experienced, does that too much.
Thank you, Terry. Would you still recommend it? And any advice?
Do you know what? It's difficult because in its current state, no. If I'm being perfectly honest, and I'm very aware I'm sat here at the British Society of Magazine Editors having this conversation, but there is a caveat, which is at its best, this industry is the best industry in the world. And when I started out because I grew up on a council estate, and magazines for me were my complete escape. They were like a gang that I could join because I had no mates, because I was a sado, used to sit in and watch wrestling and never go out and play. And it was this incredible gang that I got to join via the pages of the magazine. And all I ever wanted to do was work in magazines. And when I did, it was, for the most part, absolutely incredible. What worries me currently is the lack of commitment by the people in charge of our publishing companies to do two things. One, invest and support talent, not just be happy to see it walk out the door and think I'll save 20 grand on that person's salary with the next person who's more junior. And secondly, really innovate. So we talk a lot about innovation in this industry. And having worked at publishing companies, both here and in America, everybody's so obsessed with managing decline rather than innovating and investing in exciting new products. And we've lost this fearlessness that British magazines used to have. So I've always said British magazines are the best in the world because they're not conservative, they're bold, they're brave, they can be brash, they can be radical. We've created some of the greatest magazines in the world in this country. And what I fear is that with kind of, as the economic situation has become more difficult in magazine publishing, we've lost that bravery and we've lost that ability and just like we used to be fearless, and I've seen that drain out of the industry, not out of the talent, I have to say, but out of the management. And I think instead of going, oh, how do we squeeze the bottom line so we drop 2% instead of 5%, it's like, what amazing new thing can we launch, whether it's a digital product, whether it's something, an app, whether it's something, a social brand, whether it is a print magazine, because, spoiler, people still buy print magazines. That's what our industry needs to do so that it's still relevant and alive in 20 years, because otherwise I don't think it will be. And my advice would be develop a specialism. So the magazines that will never die are the specialist magazines. And work at Empire, that would also be my... Well, actually, no, because they don't support their staff or resource properly. Don't work at Empire, but buy it.
Until it changes.
But buy it, it's a great magazine.
Thank you. Eleanor?
I think the industry has a real structural problem because, as we've heard, the people kind of coming in now need to be able to work basically on free internships in order to be able to get in the door. And that means that you get a certain type of person coming in. And we talk about kind of progress or, diversity. But if you have only, posh middle class kids coming into publishing, then you miss huge talent, as Terry is a massive, example of. So I think as an industry, we need to really look at that intake and be doing a hell of a lot more to widen access. And really, magazines should be running talent competitions for people to kind of send in articles or ideas or interviews or what they're interested in, much more than they do. And then giving young kids from poor backgrounds the money to stay in London for a couple of weeks while they do an internship. Those are the kind of things that would actually make a massive difference, I think. I think journalism is the best job in the world. It doesn't feel like a job. You're being paid to do what other people would love to be doing. I've met everyone from Mikhail Gorbachev to the Dalai Lama to Sheryl Sandberg to 4 or 5 prime ministers doing interviews. I mean, I've had an amazing ringside seat on history for the last 25 years. I'm looking at Gerald's scarf around here. I used to run the comment bits of the Sunday Times. I was part of commissioning some of these things. So it feels very, I feel a huge privilege and honour to have been part of that industry. But I do think, but the problem is because it's so exciting and it gets you a front row seat on something that everyone else wants, there's a kind of bit of a sense that the people coming through and doing it are like cannon fodder, that there's always going to be loads more to replace us. And I think as an industry, that is unwise because what's going on is we're just losing so much kind of cultural capital, and particularly with the newspapers, when the kind of older people go who've been trained in a kind of oral tradition which actually goes back hundreds of years of Fleet Street, that's not replaceable. you know, that the kind of the wit of the kind of sub-editors' headlines, or the way that you were taught to write copy, that knowledge has actually vanished from our industry. And I think that's true of magazines too. I was lucky enough to edit the Sunday Times magazine, the oldest glossy, you know, print magazine, you know, in Fleet Street, and that has an amazing history. It's done some incredible things, from the pictures that it ran from the Vietnam War to, you know, to really changing attitudes. So I think that publishing has such a huge part to play in how we see the world, that it's just massively important that that is representative and, as I said before, is a truly reflecting mirror, and that all of us, whenever we hire someone, should have that in the back of our minds. You know, is this going to kind of broaden the kind of expanse of the industry? So, and my advice now is, knowing that actually the industry is slightly shrinking, that there's not very much investment going in it, I would say enjoy the ride. I always used to feel like I was on a wave. I was like a surfer on a wave, my journalistic career, and I caught a wave really young. I was really lucky, and I rode it all the way through to when I was 50, and it was a wild ride. But what I wish I'd known is that, what I kind of always knew, but I think it's worth really thinking about, is that at some point you will get thrown off your wave. You know, either you'll get pushed off it, or you'll fall off, or something will happen so you don't go on doing it anymore. So I would say future-proof yourself. If you're going to be a journalist, you do what Terry says, get yourself a specialism. Think about what you might do when you're not being a journalist anymore, you're not working for that publication. Because what helped me most in my shift out of being a massive newspaper executive into running my own thing was actually all the things that I'd done which were not part of the Sunday Times. It was running women in journalism. It was the huge kind of hinterland of people that I'd helped or supported, or the causes that I really cared about. So I would say really follow your heart and think about what you'll do when you fall off your wave early.
Thank you so much. I just want to invite everyone to give the panel a round of applause, because I think that was absolutely fantastic. Thanks so much. Please do remember to tag Rosewood, and thank you very much to the BSME for organising this brilliant event. I'm going to quickly hand back to Deborah to close.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely incredible. What did you all think? Did you find it inspiring? I found myself nodding along to absolutely every bit of it. Really got nothing else to say other than please support us, join our events, give us feedback. We want to make the BSME a super exciting, diverse, inclusive place to be part of, and really we want to create a community of women, of men, of everybody who works in our incredible industry, because it is a wild ride. I mean, I come to work every day. Do you know what me and my team say? Buckle up. Yeah. That's the beginning of the day, because you just don't know what incredible experience and opportunity is going to come your way. So thank you so much. You're all honestly an inspiration to me personally. So it was really incredible to hear you all talk. Thank you. Thank you.
For coming as well.
Yeah, thank you.